Hello, friends. We are living in a time when the word government no longer means what it used to. It no longer means coordination, service, or leadership. It has become a weapon, a club in the hands of those who already have too much power, wielded against those who have too little. Today, as we speak, the United States, the richest country in human history, cannot pay its own workers. The lights are on in Washington, but no one's home. Nearly 1 million federal employees are without pay, entire programs have ground to a halt, and the so-called leader of the free world, Donald Trump, is collapsing under the weight of the very system he promised to fix. But my friends, this is not an accident. It is design. When Donald Trump came into office again, he promised to run government like a business. Well, he kept that promise. He has indeed run the government like a business, meaning it's full of debt, corruption, layoffs, and ruthless self-interest. The shutdown is not a failure of government. It's the government performing exactly as designed, a system so captured by private wealth that it cannot even function without asking permission from billionaires. Look closely. Trump isn't in control of the shutdown. The shutdown is in control of Trump. He's not the architect. He's the actor in a play written by the class that funds him. And this, my friends, is the true tragedy of the American empire. The man who shouted, "Make America Great Again," is now held hostage by the very forces that made America broken. Let's unpack this. A government shutdown is a peculiar invention. Only a society that worships profit over people could come up with something like this. In most of the developed world, if the state runs out of money, it borrows, it reforms, it adjusts. But in America, the government simply stops because the two political parties cannot agree on who should suffer more. During a shutdown, what stops? Public health care programs, inspections on food safety, aid for the poor, wages for teachers, nurses, and scientists. And what continues? Military spending, congressional salaries, subsidies to oil companies, bailouts for banks that already have record profits. So the question isn't, why did the government shut down? The real question is, why does it keep running only for the rich? Donald Trump, my friends, is not just a politician, he is a performer. And the shutdown is his stage. He steps out in front of cameras, declaring, "We're fighting for the American people," while hundreds of thousands of those same people are wondering how to pay rent. He tweets about waste in government, while the Pentagon misplaces $3 trillion it cannot account for. He boasts of record stock markets, while 40% of Americans can't handle a $400 emergency. This is not leadership. This is theater, a performance of strength meant to hide weakness, a show of confidence to cover up collapse. The shutdown is not just a budgetary dispute, it's a moral collapse of a system that has forgotten what government is for. Let's be clear. Donald Trump didn't invent this chaos. He is the symptom, not the disease. Behind him stand the same interests that have haunted every administration since Reagan, the corporate donors, the fossil fuel giants, the financial class that turned democracy into a vending machine. These people love a shutdown, because every time government fails, it gives them an excuse to privatize more, deregulate more, and convince the public that markets work better. It's not a malfunction, it's a business model. When air traffic controllers work without pay, someone will say, maybe a private company could do this better. When the NIH halts medical research, they'll say, let's fund it privately. When the WIC program for children runs out of cash, they'll whisper, charity can handle it. Step by step, inch by inch, the public sector shrinks, the private grows, and the illusion of freedom expands. That's the paradox of capitalism. It thrives on its own failures. Now, imagine the psychology of power. Trump built his identity on the illusion of control, the deal maker, the strongman, the alpha male who bends the world to his will. But a shutdown is a situation where control is impossible. You cannot tweet your way out of a frozen budget. You cannot negotiate with unpaid air traffic controllers. You cannot bully economic reality. And so, the pressure builds. Each day the markets tremble. Each week agencies go dark. Each month the president looks weaker and the strongman image begins to crack. Trump has lived his life leveraging debt, but now he is the one being leveraged. By his own Congress, by his donors, by the very capitalist system that created him. So when I say Trump is collapsing under shutdown pressure, I don't just mean his approval ratings. I mean the collapse of the myth he represents, the myth of capitalist competence, the illusion that the businessman can save the state. In truth, business can never save the state because business needs a weak state to exploit. It's like asking a fox to guard the henhouse. Trump promised to drain the swamp, but in doing so, he handed the swamp to the alligators. And now, as the government shudders, the people who believed in his promise, the workers, the farmers, the small business owners, are the ones drowning. Friends, remember this. A shutdown is not about politicians losing face. It's about ordinary people losing food, healthcare, housing, and hope. The janitor at a federal building in Ohio, the air traffic controller in Los Angeles, the mother relying on WIC in Texas. They are the real casualties. They did not create this crisis, but they are forced to pay for it. Meanwhile, the architects of this system, the lobbyists, the hedge funds, the defense contractors, are having champagne lunches because every crisis is a profit opportunity. As Marx once said, capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. But before it collapses, it harvests as much as it can. Look beyond the shutdown and you'll see a larger story, the story of empire fatigue. When the Roman Empire began to crumble, it wasn't because of barbarians at the gate. It was because of unpaid soldiers, corrupt senators, and a treasury emptied by greed. Sound familiar? The U.S. empire today faces the same internal rot. Endless wars abroad, inequality at home, and a political class that performs governance instead of practicing it. The shutdown is not the cause of decline. It is the symptom of it. It's the sound of an empire gasping for air, as the weight of its contradictions crushes its own lungs. Let's pause here, because in the next part, we're going to look deeper into the economic engine behind this collapse. How debt became destiny, how the dollar became a weapon, and how every shutdown in American history has moved us one step closer to exposing what capitalism truly is. A system that cannot afford to care. Let's start with a truth we are not supposed to say out loud. The United States is not broke because it cannot afford to pay its bills. It is broke because it chooses to be. It chooses to give billions to defense contractors while closing schools. It chooses to subsidize Wall Street while furloughing federal workers. It chooses to build bombs instead of bridges. And then, when the inevitable happens, when the house of cards trembles, the same people who built it turn to us and say, "Sorry, folks, the government has run out of money." But the truth, my friends, is that the United States has never run out of money. It has only ever run out of priorities. If you look closely at every American crisis, from 2008 to 2025, there's always the same invisible scaffolding holding it up. Debt. Debt is not just an economic instrument, it is a political weapon. It decides who gets to live free and who stays trapped. The government borrows from the rich not because it must, but because it wants to keep them in charge. It could tax them, it could regulate them, but borrowing is safer for them. Because when the state borrows, the rich become its lenders, and every shutdown becomes a negotiation between debtor and creditor. The government is the debtor, Wall Street is the creditor, and Trump, he is the collection agent. Let's pause on that image for a moment. Think of the irony. Donald Trump, the self-proclaimed master of the art of the deal, has become the man who can't make a deal even to pay his own workers. He built an empire of bankruptcy, and now, the empire he rules is bankrupt in spirit. He branded himself as the savior of the working class, and now, those same workers are the ones missing paychecks because of him. He once said, "Only I can fix it." Now it is clear he never intended to fix it, only to profit from it, because, friends, Trump doesn't fear debt, he worships it. He lives by it, manipulates it, and like any good capitalist, he weaponizes it. But here's the danger. You can manipulate debt in real estate. You cannot manipulate it in a society. When you build a skyscraper on borrowed money, it's the bank that collapses if you default. When you build a nation on borrowed money, it's the people who collapse when the system does. Every time a shutdown happens, politicians climb onto podiums to speak about fiscal responsibility. They talk about tightening belts, living within our means, balancing the budget. It sounds moral, doesn't it? Except it's a lie, because while they tell you we can't afford universal health care, they pass tax cuts worth trillions. While they say we need austerity, they send blank checks to the Pentagon. While they cut food programs, they raise military budgets. Fiscal responsibility in Washington means making sure the poor pay for the rich. The shutdown is not a sign of overspending. It's a sign of understanding misplaced, a misunderstanding of what government is for. Government is not a business, it's a social contract. And when you treat that contract like a corporation, it collapses. Let's analyze this as economists, shall we? When production slows, when workers are unpaid, when demand drops, the system enters contraction. That contraction reduces GDP, which lowers tax revenue, which widens the deficit, and so the very austerity used to save the system ends up shrinking it further. That's called the downward spiral of capitalism. And it happens because the system's priority is not sustainability but profit. If you look at history, every great empire, British, Spanish, Roman, collapsed not from invasion, but from fiscal cannibalism. They ate themselves from within, financing wars, luxury, and corruption until the internal organs of the state gave out. The American empire is doing the same, but with a modern twist. It hides its cannibalism under the language of efficiency. Now, look at how the media presents this. They call it political deadlock. They say both sides are to blame. But that's not analysis, that's theater criticism, because the shutdown is not a random accident of two parties disagreeing. It is the logical outcome of a political class bought and sold by capital. If the media told the truth, headlines would read, "Corporate donors halt government until demands are met," because that's what this really is, a corporate strike. The difference is when workers strike, they do it for justice. When corporations strike, they do it for power. And don't think the world isn't watching. When Washington shuts down, Beijing smiles. When federal agencies stop, BRICS accelerates. When the U.S. can't govern itself, other nations start asking, who gave this country the right to tell the rest of us how to run ours? This is not just an internal crisis, it's a geopolitical earthquake. Because the shutdown erodes the myth of American stability, the very myth that underpins the dollar, the treasury market, and U.S. dominance abroad. If America cannot guarantee continuity, how long before the world stops trusting its currency? How long before "in God we trust" becomes "in chaos we live"? Let's turn, for a moment, from economics to morality. Every unpaid worker, every closed food program, every delayed check, these are ethical debts. They do not appear on balance sheets, but they accumulate in anger, in despair, and disillusionment. And when a society's moral debt grows large enough, it collects in protest, in populism, in revolt. The January 6th riot was not an isolated madness. It was the interest payment on decades of social neglect. And this shutdown is another bill coming due. When Trump uses the government as a hostage, the people become collateral. And when the system normalizes that, collapse is not a question of if, but when. Friends, history teaches us that collapse is rarely sudden. It begins with little cracks, unpaid workers, unfunded programs, unheeded warnings, and then one day the entire structure gives way. We call it crisis, but in truth, it's just the moment when denial meets reality. The shutdown is one such crack. And Trump, the showman, is standing at the center trying to hold up the stage as the pillars fall around him. He shouts fake news at the falling beams. He blames the Democrats for the collapsing ceiling. But it doesn't matter because the foundation itself is rotten. You cannot repair a building while pretending it's still a palace. And you cannot save a system you refuse to question. People ask me, Professor Wolf, why do you always talk about collapse? Because collapse, friends, is not the end. It's the revelation. It reveals what was already broken. It forces the truth into daylight. Trump's collapse under shutdown pressure is not a tragedy, it's a mirror. It shows us what happens when power forgets purpose, when governance becomes theater, when the rich write the laws and the poor pay the price. Collapse is simply the moment when lies run out of time. We are only halfway through this story. In the next part, we will look at how the media, the markets, and the global elite use crises like this to reshape the system in their image. We'll ask the question, when the empire trembles, who profits from the quake? Because make no mistake, this shutdown is not the end of Trump's America. It is the dress rehearsal for something bigger. Whenever you hear the word crisis in America, pause for a moment because it rarely means what it says. A crisis in our system is not an accident. It is a business model. It is manufactured, managed, and monetized. It is turned into spectacle, into profit, into distraction. And if you look closely, not through the headlines but through the cracks between them, you will see the quiet hands of an empire that no longer governs but performs. That's what the shutdown really is. A performance of collapse scripted by capital, directed by politics, and starring a man named Donald Trump who confuses applause with leadership. Friends, let's start with the press. When the government shut down, what did the media say? They didn't say millions lose wages. They said Trump under pressure. They didn't say children's food aid expires. They said markets react cautiously, because the role of the modern media is not to inform the public, it's to protect the market. It's not journalism, it's brand management for capitalism. They feed you news the way fast food chains feed you calories, cheap, addictive, and empty. You get breaking news every hour but no understanding. You get passion, outrage, gossip, but never history, never context, never system. And the result? A population that feels everything and understands nothing. Now let's look at the market. Every time a shutdown happens, Wall Street reacts not in panic but in calculation. They know what you don't. Every crisis is a chance to buy low, privatize public goods, and pressure Congress for deregulation. The headlines scream uncertainty. But for hedge funds, uncertainty means opportunity. For lobbyists, paralysis means leverage. And for billionaires, fear means discount prices. The system is designed to fail publicly and recover privately. The pain is socialized, the profit is privatized. And the beauty, if you can call it that, is that the victims don't even know who to blame. Because when the media keeps you watching personalities, you forget the structure. When you argue about Trump's tweets, you forget who funds the system. When you fight your neighbor, you let the corporations walk free. Let me show you how this works. Step 1, the system fails. Step 2, the media finds a villain. Step 3, the market profits from the chaos. Step 4, the public gets distracted by moral outrage. It's brilliant and it's horrifying. In this shutdown, the villain is government itself. They tell you, government doesn't work, but what they never tell you is why it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the private sector has captured it. It doesn't work because billionaires buy policy the way you buy coffee. It doesn't work because the people who run it have no interest in fixing it, only in profiting from its failure. And so, every shutdown becomes a lesson not in economics but in obedience. You are trained to accept dysfunction as normal. You are told chaos is freedom. You are taught to distrust the collective and to worship the market. Capitalism, my friends, has its own religion and its god is blame. When prices rise, they blame the workers for wanting higher wages. When profits fall, they blame regulation. When the government stops, they blame political division. Never once do they blame the system itself. And that's the genius of American propaganda. It makes the system invisible by making the spectacle irresistible. You can't fix what you can't see, and you won't see it if you're too busy arguing about who's at fault. So while Trump and the Democrats trade insults on television, Goldman Sachs is calculating which assets to buy when the panic peaks. Amazon is preparing contracts to replace government logistics, and media outlets are selling ad space between segments of outrage. The empire collapses and it gets ratings. Friends, we live not in a democracy but in an attention economy. The real currency isn't dollars, it's distraction. That's why every headline screams. That's why every news segment bleeds drama. That's why politics now looks like professional wrestling, a morality play for a demoralized people. And Trump, the showman, understands this better than anyone. He knows the crowd. He knows the rhythm of outrage. He knows that as long as you're angry, you're not organized. So he feeds the spectacle. He says something outrageous every day, not because he's spontaneous, but because he's strategic. Because chaos is his camouflage. When everyone's shouting, no one's watching the money. And make no mistake, for all his populist talk, Trump is the best friend the market ever had. Why? Because he's predictable in his unpredictability. He creates just enough instability to justify deregulation. He produces just enough scandal to distract from the looting. The stock market loves volatility. It's a playground for speculation. And Trump is the ultimate volatility machine. While the working class worries about paychecks, investors are betting on which sector will fall next and buying futures on your fear. That, my friends, is the real Wall Street hustle. They don't sell products. They sell anxiety and they profit from it. Now let's zoom out. The rest of the world is watching this circus, shaking their heads but also taking notes. Beijing learns how the American system collapses from within. Moscow learns how propaganda is monetized. BRICS nations see opportunity. If America is busy fighting itself, maybe we can build the new order. Trump is not just collapsing under pressure. He's teaching the world how fragile the American empire really is. He's proving that you don't need bombs to destroy an empire. You just need capitalism at full speed, unregulated, unrestrained, and unapologetic. Friends, never forget. Collapse doesn't happen when the system breaks. It happens when the people stop believing it can change. And that's the goal of the media market machine, to make you feel hopeless, tired, cynical. Because a hopeless citizen doesn't rebel, he scrolls. A tired worker doesn't organize, she prays. A cynical generation doesn't build, it laughs. And in that silence, the powerful feast. This shutdown isn't just the government falling apart, it's faith in collective action being dismantled piece by piece. It's psychological warfare disguised as budgetary policy. And the longer it lasts, the deeper the doubt sets in. Until one day, democracy itself feels like an illusion and tyranny feels like relief. Let's be honest. America doesn't make much anymore. It doesn't produce cars, it doesn't produce semiconductors, it barely produces its own medicine. What it produces in infinite quantities is illusion. Illusion of wealth through credit. Illusion of choice through consumption. Illusion of power through politics. Illusion of progress through technology. This shutdown tears away that curtain. It shows us what happens when illusion meets infrastructure, when the world's richest country can't even pay its workers. That's not incompetence. That's ideology. That's capitalism showing you its real face. Cold, efficient, and utterly indifferent. Friends, we've seen this before. Every empire that falls goes through 3 stages: expansion through force, corruption through greed, collapse through illusion. Rome had its circuses, Britain had its colonies, America has its cable news, bread and circuses. That's the formula. Keep the people entertained, keep them afraid, and you can take everything else. The difference is that today the circus is global and the bread is running out. But here's the part they can't control. Every illusion eventually breaks. Every spectacle ends. The worker who misses 1 paycheck blames himself. The worker who misses 2 starts to question. And the worker who misses 3 starts to organize. That's the moment of awakening, friends. That's when collapse turns into clarity. That's when a shutdown becomes a showdown, not between parties, but between classes. Trump's collapse under pressure is not just a headline, it's a signal. The empire is blinking red. And when empires blink, revolutions learn to see in the dark. We are entering the next act of this global theater, where illusion gives way to instability, and instability gives birth to something new. In the next part, we will look at the global consequences of America's internal collapse, how the world's other powers are moving to fill the vacuum, and what that means for all of us living through it. History has a rhythm, And today, we are living inside its drumbeat. When the heart of an empire falters, the echo is heard across the world. The American shutdown is not just an internal affair, it's a global event. It tells the world that the emperor, for all his gold and grandeur, has no clothes left to wear. And when the empire stumbles, every nation starts moving differently, some to distance themselves, some to prepare for opportunity, and some to take the throne. Look first at America's allies. Once when Washington sneezed, the world caught a cold. Now when Washington collapses, the world shrugs. European leaders Macron, Scholz, Sunak watch this shutdown with quiet calculation. They no longer see America as the anchor of stability, but as a ship adrift in a storm it created. They are tired of the moral lectures, the sanctions, the wars that drain their economies while Wall Street profits. They remember the humiliation of Afghanistan, the chaos of Iraq, the arrogance of Trump's trade wars. And now, as the U.S. government shuts itself down, they begin to whisper in Brussels. Maybe it's time we stop depending on America's leadership. That, friends, is the first tremor of imperial decline, when allies begin to prepare for life after you. Meanwhile, far from Washington, something extraordinary is happening. In Johannesburg, in Shanghai, in Sao Paulo, the BRICS nations are holding quiet celebrations. Why? Because every time America trips, the rest of the world takes another step toward multipolarity. BRICS has just added 6 new members, nations representing more than half the world's population and a third of global GDP. They are building new trade routes, new currencies, new institutions. They no longer whisper about de-dollarization, they are doing it. And here's the irony. While Trump shuts down his own government to fight over imaginary budgets, the BRICS nations are opening up new economic corridors that bypass the dollar altogether. Every American shutdown is a free advertisement for an alternative world order, because when the world sees the U.S. unable to pay its workers, it starts asking, if they can't govern themselves, why should they govern the global economy? Now, let's turn to the most disciplined player in this game, China. Beijing doesn't gloat. It doesn't mock, it watches. Patiently, strategically, it sees an empire that's too divided to plan, too indebted to reform, and too distracted by culture wars to compete. While Washington debates gender in Congress, Beijing debates trade routes in Africa. While America argues about statues, China builds railroads. While Trump blames immigrants, China builds ports. And all the while, Beijing learns not from America's successes but from its failures. It studies how an empire collapses from within. It learns how financial overreach destroys legitimacy. It learns how political theater weakens credibility. When the time comes, when the dollar trembles, when markets panic, when allies waver, China won't have to attack. It will simply replace. That is how empires die in the 21st century, not with war but with irrelevance. Then there is Russia, bruised, sanctioned, but not broken. Putin understands something the West refuses to admit. Power doesn't vanish when an empire collapses. It redistributes. The shutdown in Washington, to him, is not chaos, it's opportunity. Because every vacuum invites new players. Every silence begs for a new voice. Moscow is rebuilding alliances across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. They call it multipolarity, but it's really survival with ambition. When America retreats, Russia advances in influence, in arms, in oil. And while Trump argues about budgets, Putin signs energy deals denominated not in dollars, but in rubles and yuan. That's not economics, that's geopolitics in motion. And what about the so-called developing world? For the first time in modern history, it smells weakness in the empire's breath. From Nairobi to New Delhi, from Jakarta to Buenos Aires, nations are watching this American shutdown not with pity, but with realization. Their system is not invincible. For decades, the IMF and World Bank lectured the Global South about fiscal responsibility. Now, those same institutions are funded by a government that can't even pass its own budget. So when these nations turn to BRICS or to regional alliances, they are not rebelling. They are adapting to a new reality. The The West no longer owns the future. And that, friends, is perhaps the most radical change of our century, the psychological emancipation of the global South from Western authority. Let's talk about the dollar, the sacred cow of American supremacy. For nearly 80 years, it has been the world's reserve currency, the backbone of global trade, the language of power. But every shutdown chips away at its credibility. Investors may still buy U.S. bonds, but they are beginning to ask a dangerous question. What if this government stops functioning? A shutdown is not just a political embarrassment, it's a financial warning sign. It tells the world that U.S. governance is unstable, unpredictable, and partisan to the point of paralysis. And money, friends, hates instability. That's why central banks across Asia and the Middle East are hoarding gold, not dollars. That's why oil contracts are increasingly priced in yuan. That's why digital currencies backed by state assets are emerging as alternatives. The dollar is not dying tomorrow, but for the first time in a century it's being questioned. And in the world of finance, doubt is the beginning of death. Now, let's return briefly to Europe, the old partner, the fading mirror. Europe looks at America and sees its own future. Polarized, unequal, overleveraged, and spiritually exhausted. The European Union is struggling to define itself between U.S. dependency and global autonomy. They are watching the shutdown with dread because they know, if America sneezes, Europe doesn't just catch a cold, it catches a crisis. Their industries depend on U.S. energy prices, their banks on U.S. liquidity, their defense on U.S. power. And yet, they also know that the longer this dependency lasts, the weaker they become. So quietly in think tanks and ministries, a new question emerges. Can Europe afford to bet its survival on a collapsing empire? That question, friends, is the whisper that ends alliances. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, something equally profound is happening. For decades, Washington's control over the region rested on oil, arms, and fear. But as America shuts itself down, that grip loosens. Saudi Arabia trades with China in yuan. Iran re-enters global markets through BRICS channels. Turkey flirts with both East and West, playing one against the other. And Israel, facing both war and waning U.S. attention, begins to realize that American guarantees are no longer guaranteed. When the empire is distracted, the vassals improvise. That's the rule of history. And Trump's America, paralyzed by internal decay, is the perfect distraction. Friends, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. When Washington stops leading, someone else always will. But leadership in a multipolar world doesn't mean stability, it means competition, uncertainty, and constant negotiation. As the U.S. retreats inward, we are witnessing the birth of a new global disorder. Not one empire replacing another, but many powers circling around the corpse of the old one, each pulling at its limbs. That's why conflicts multiply, why currencies clash, why trade alliances form and break overnight. We are not witnessing peace. We are witnessing rearrangement, the messy birth of a post-American world. But perhaps the most devastating consequence of all is not economic or military, it is moral. For generations, America told the world it was a beacon of democracy. It lectured others about transparency, accountability, freedom. Now, that same nation cannot even pay its workers or run its Congress without chaos. When Washington shuts down, its moral authority shuts down with it. And once moral authority is lost, no amount of military might can replace it. That's how empires truly die, not when they lose wars, but when they lose the world's belief in their virtue. Friends, here is the lesson of all of this. Power never disappears, it merely changes hands. When America uses its power to dominate instead of cooperate, to exploit instead of uplift, it ensures that others will one day do the same to it. That's the dialectic of history. The oppressed learns from the oppressor, and one day the roles reverse. What we are seeing today is not the fall of the West, but the graduation of the rest, and Trump's collapse under shutdown pressure. That's just the ceremony marking the handover. Friends, In the next and final part, we will talk about what comes after collapse, not just for Trump or America, but for all of us living in a system that can no longer sustain itself. We'll ask, what does renewal look like in a world built on decay? Can democracy survive capitalism's contradictions? And what happens when the people stop believing in the illusion altogether? When an empire collapses, the dust takes a long time to settle. But inside that dust, inside the confusion, the fear, the shouting, there's something extraordinary happening. The birth of a new consciousness. Every collapse carries a message. It says, the old order no longer works. It says, the stories we told ourselves have expired. It says, you cannot live forever on illusions of power, profit, and patriotism. And right now, as America shuts down its own government, as Donald Trump gasps beneath the weight of his own contradictions, that message is echoing across the world. The era of pretending is over. For decades, the United States pretended that capitalism was democracy. It pretended that markets were freedom. It pretended that billionaires were job creators. And it pretended that empire was leadership. But this shutdown, this paralysis of the richest government in human history, tears away all those masks. Because what kind of democracy can't feed its own workers? What kind of freedom leaves millions in debt? What kind of leadership shuts down its government to satisfy the greed of donors? When the pretense collapses, truth walks in slowly, painfully, but inevitably. And the truth, friends, is this. America isn't broken because Trump broke it. Trump exists because America was already broken. He is not the cause, he is the consequence. Let's say it clearly. Trump's collapse under shutdown pressure is not the failure of one man, it's the unmasking of a myth. The myth that capitalism can be moral. The myth that greed can be managed. The myth that inequality can be tolerated indefinitely. Every empire builds its myth of permanence. Rome said it would last forever, it didn't. Britain said the sun would never set on its empire, it did. America says it's exceptional. But exception, my friends, is just another word for denial. Empires fall for the same reason every time. They forget the difference between wealth and wisdom, between power and purpose, between spectacle and substance. Think about it. What does a collapse look like from the inside? It doesn't begin with fire or invasion. It begins with disbelief, with people refusing to see what's right in front of them. It begins when citizens start saying, it can't happen here. And that's exactly when it happens. In 2025, the United States isn't being attacked by an enemy. It's being hollowed out by its own system, a system that treats workers as costs, democracy as theater, and morality as marketing. The shutdown is not a crisis, it's a confession that the system no longer believes in itself. But here's the paradox of collapse, it wakes people up. When paychecks stop, illusions stop too. When the government fails, the people begin to look at each other differently, not as competitors, not as strangers, but as fellow victims of the same machine. And from that realization, solidarity is born. We've seen it before, in the Great Depression, in the labor strikes of the 1930s, in the civil rights movement, in the Occupy camps. Each time the system breaks, the people remember something powerful, that they are the ones who make the system run. Not the billionaires, not the politicians, not the markets, the workers, the teachers, the nurses, the drivers, the people. That's why, even as the empire crumbles, there is hope, because collapse can also be a beginning. Friends, let's talk about morality, the word capitalism fears most. You see, a shutdown is not just economic dysfunction. It's moral exposure. It shows you who matters and who doesn't. Military, paid on time. Wall Street, protected. Members of Congress still collecting salaries, but the janitor, the nurse, the child care worker, forgotten. That is moral bankruptcy, and it's more devastating than financial bankruptcy. Because when a society loses its sense of justice, it loses the reason to exist. The question we must ask is not, how do we restart the government? It's, what kind of government deserves to start again? Friends, if this shutdown teaches us anything, it's that we need to imagine differently. We need to stop asking how to fix capitalism and start asking what comes after it. We need economies built on cooperation, not competition. Enterprises owned by workers, not shareholders. Policies guided by need, not greed. Education that teaches solidarity, not submission. Richard Wolff has said it many times: democracy at the ballot box is meaningless without democracy at the workplace. Because if your boss controls your livelihood, then democracy stops at the factory gate. To rebuild after this collapse, we must democratize the economy itself. That's not utopian, that's survival. Every collapse writes a lesson in history. Rome's was, you cannot build eternal empires. Britain's was, you cannot enslave the world and stay free yourself. America's will be, you cannot run a society on profit without paying the price. Capitalism, friends, is not immortal, it's human. And like all human creations, it carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. When profit devours purpose, when markets devour morality, collapse is not a tragedy, it's justice. Let's not forget the symbol at the center of this: Donald Trump. He wanted to be the emperor of capitalism, a man above the system, untouchable, unaccountable, adored by markets and feared by enemies. But in the end, the same forces he served are the ones crushing him. The donors who funded him are now demanding results. The billionaires who cheered him are now hedging against him. The party that praised him is now preparing for his exit. He is collapsing under the weight of his own illusion. The illusion that you can lead without empathy, govern without competence, and exploit without consequence. That is not just Trump's story. That is capitalism's story told through him. So what comes next? That depends on us. Every collapse opens two doors. One leads to tyranny, the other to transformation. When people lose faith in the system, they can turn to strongmen, to demagogues who promise order at the price of freedom. Or they can turn to each other, to solidarity, to organization, to rebuilding democracy from below. Trump is the door to tyranny. But the other door, the one labeled people's power, is still open. The question is, will we walk through it? And the world, friends, is watching. They are not just seeing America collapse. They are seeing capitalism exposed. They are learning that the so-called rules-based order only works for those who wrote the rules. If the U.S. cannot embody democracy, then others will redefine it. If the West cannot sustain equality, then others will demand it. If capitalism cannot reform itself, then humanity will outgrow it. That's not prophecy, that's history in motion. Friends, we are living through a rare moment, a moment when history pauses and asks us, what are you going to do with what you know? We can no longer claim ignorance. We have seen the empire stumble. We have seen power naked. We have seen the system without its mask. The question now is not, can it be fixed? The question is, will we build something better? That's the real shutdown, not of government, but of conscience. When citizens stop believing they can change the world becomes unchangeable. But when they remember their power, no empire can stand against them. Friends, don't let despair paralyze you. Collapse is terrifying, yes, but it is also cleansing. It washes away lies, it clears the stage for truth, and truth is a stubborn thing. You can suppress it for decades, but when it resurfaces, it reshapes everything. So let us not mourn the shutdown of empire. Let us celebrate the awakening of people. Because in the end, the story of humanity is not the story of kings, presidents, or billionaires. It's the story of ordinary people who refuse to stay silent. And if history has any justice left, this collapse will not be remembered as America's end, but as the moment the world began to demand something better. We are not spectators of history. We are participants in it. And if the old world is dying, then our duty is not to save it, but to build the next one. So when you see the news say Trump is collapsing under shutdown pressure, remember, it's not just Trump. It's the entire order built on greed, inequality, and illusion. And maybe, just maybe, that's the best news we've had in a very long time.